you used the phrase, the kind of plug-in program, which I thought was very interesting because it suggests something that in a way is much more adaptable and flexible rather than a kind of large overarching program. And I think that's partly the sensibility of what we're trying to do with the independence group. But my question is more towards the other consultants and the industry partners potentially about what they see in terms of the benefits to them, or their interest in that kind of collaboration as a kind of, if you like, laboratory or plug-in laboratory that works alongside your own either professional processes or industrial manufacturing processes, and what you would hope to learn from it. So actually, I think I'll start with you since you're looking at me.
Because I was the last one. Well, the good thing is that the discussions have already started. Yeah, I'm just looking over here. Yeah, and we've already started to talk about we need to meet up and we need to talk about how we can connect better in bringing, closing the gap, as you call it. Yeah, and bringing our work actually closer to the constructors' work, because what happens at our end very often, and I think it is a sort of development that's been going on for a while, that the aesthetically driven type of approach to architecture is sort of getting a little bit removed from the tectonic element, from the building side of things, and to bring that back into the discussion has been a bit the engineer's job, as it were. Yeah. So we are. I said it to you earlier. We are the builders here, yeah. And Sophie was saying it as well. We are the builders, but we are actually not the builders. We're the engineers. The builders are the Langeroeks and the Zainers and those guys of this world. And we want to connect much closer to them in order to understand their processes better, and then find that middle ground. I was mentioning it in my talk, yeah, where we can design. It is difficult to explain this. Whilst we need to design better for manufacture, we also need to keep it looser so that we can be open for the suggestions and the input from the manufacturer. So that the door isn't closed at that point, and I can only use one system, or I have no more room for alternatives. I've basically detailed it too far and done abortive work. And it's this group, I think, and then linking back to academia as well, where this is taught, and we had a discussion over lunch that it is about making things and building things, and that's coming back to architecture schools. That this discussion needs to happen, I think, to make this process smoother, more interesting, and the quality of our buildings much better.
But I guess my question sort of comes back to...
I didn't hear the question because I wasn't here yet, yeah. And you asked it.
No, my question comes back to that sort of relationship that you're talking about between, say, consultants and manufacturers. Obviously, there's an opportunity for it to be closer. But what are the advantages, or how would you see that played out in a more experimental setting? That, for example, institutions like the AA, the CCA, and these kinds of labs we're talking about, this kind of plug-in model that could provide that experimental environment, how do you imagine that becoming a kind of benefit or a way of conducting, let's say, a kind of loose research agenda?
Well, I've noticed a sort of mutual stimulus, yeah, over the past few years, maybe a couple of decades or so, yeah, that design progress and ambitious ideas in design have sparked off ambitious idea in manufacturing, and the one has followed the other. But what has happened is the reverse has happened as well, that new methods in construction and interesting and challenging ways of constructing things have actually influenced architecture. And I think this is this crossover where it becomes really, really interesting, where the manufacturing process can be going from following to leading, and then you get a proper kind of two-way relationship there, because at one time one leads, the other time another leads, yeah, and that's I find that very, very interesting. I think also for the future of this program, I think we need to expand it. Yeah, we've talked a lot about structures, we talked a lot about building. We talked a lot about the sort of the physical elements of building. What we haven't talked much about is the building environment. We haven't. Yes, we talked about the light, the rain of light. Yeah, but we actually focused on how the model was built. So we to bring that back into the discussion, the technology that comes with it, the physicality of the technology that comes with it, but also the influence of some of the design principles of environmental design onto the structure, onto the performance of our materials. I think that is a discussion that will be very, very important for the next years to come. Sorry for the span of the works. What, we just pass it around, no?
There's plenty of microphones, so if anybody else has anything to add to that.
One thing that does intrigue me is that, is to have a better understanding of how the very far front of innovation and ideas that tend to happen in the academic world, how does that actually eventually translates itself into more general, better products, systems, way of life? Would be quite interesting to focus on some of these things and what has been the consequence of that particular. Sometimes it takes time, doesn't it? There is a brilliant idea there, but the rest of the world's not ready to make the most of it. But eventually, it penetrates.
Well, Gary, you seem, I didn't see you there, but you seem to, in Zaner, have an extraordinary capacity to take these kinds of special projects. For example, you do a lot of art-based projects you were mentioning, which really I would imagine are these kind of one-off special projects, but you seem to be able to translate that into the wider production processes of the company.
Yes.
For example, like kind of really developing it as a solution that then gets applied across a number of different products.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, the interaction with the artists and the architects that come to visit Zaner, we do tours of our plant typically every Friday, and we bring universities in, but they're only there for an hour, right? And they can't be out in the plant because it's union and there's safety but we would encourage them, people to, if maybe another way to discuss it and to follow on Wolf's idea is that what we do is engineered aesthetics. We engineer these things so that they're beautiful. And the aesthetic part of it we can deal with, but we want to push it just all that much further. So having a dialogue with a university or a group of artists or students. Our Saturday mornings are 9 o'clock in the morning. We have coffee and the students will come in and work with us and think about things where there isn't safety issues, plus you don't get bugged by the phones. So there's a lot, the dialogue is just, it's challenging for us that they push us with their thoughts about what their art might be like. And we use it to further embellish what our architectural offerings are or constitute.
And like Wolf was saying, I think it is very much a two-way street now, where we get challenged by the models and the design intent by architects at the same time when they come visit our shop, and we actually can play around with some concepts while they're there, or if they see another project that we've done, that in itself inspires them as well to push other limits. They see some opportunities that even a lot of times they'll use something that we've done or something that we show them, and they will create something else that we haven't done yet. But they'll take that and push it to another level. And I think that goes back and forth quite a bit. And that's what I'm seeing. There's a lot more back and forth interaction.
Can I ask how do you do that specifically in relation to academia? What you've done in the past? I mean, it's obvious how it happens in relation to projects that are being built. Mm-hmm. I think one of the bigger challenges is how we make that connection with where we're constructing projects, or sort of simulating projects, which is what happens in the studio, where we're setting up a kind of theoretical project often enough that doesn't have a client et cetera. How has it operated with you previously with academic institutions?
I think it comes back to what Gary was saying, that we invite a lot of local schools in, and they come and take tours. We've had some visits to their facility as well. We work directly with them on more artistic creations, not so much architectural because the scale is different, but on smaller scale artistic creations, we will work with them and actually manufacture some things with them. But that again is still kind of limited to like a regional aspect around us. We do have sometimes, Gary, you can probably elaborate on this, but we do have schools calling us up now from a farther distance wanting to come and visit our facility and connect with us. But for the most part, we're really connected very well locally, but not so much at a distance.
The specifics of these relationships, though, I think are so important because they ultimately suggest, in a kind of a middle or long-term view of architectural education, that there may be primary shifts in what it is we're actually teaching students to do. And I find it, well, I was at a presentation from Autodesk in Hong Kong last week, which began with a kind of a video of a woman, an architect, coming to a site and taking out her iPad and photographing the site, analyzing it, designing the building, evaluating the building, organizing its construction, and then folding the thing up and leaving as the building is being built. And the notion, Brett mentioned the increasing democratization of hardware. And we already, of course, exist in a world where knowledge has been increasingly democratized. The notion that all Shigeru Ban has to do is pass you a kind of a chicken wire model and a couple of faxed or iPhone photographed sketches. One then wonders, is it necessary? Does the architect, as the kind of idea haver, need to know the specifics of how a thing is put together? And what also are the dangers of moving into that kind of a universe? Because we've democratized knowledge, we've democratized hardware. Soon enough we're going to democratize having ideas, at which point the fabricator sitting around this table will increasingly find the architects a kind of an annoyance or a liability and no longer a necessity. Why you need Shigeru Ban or Frank Gehry to give you that model rather than making one yourselves ultimately should be a question that you're all asking here. And I raise these questions because I feel like the exchanges of this nature are so valuable and so important not just to kind of furthering the profession of architecture, let's say, or furthering a particular industry, but ultimately to defining them and to defining in some cases, to defining whether or not they'll survive. So I feel like to come a long way around to my original point, I feel like looking at some of the existing relationships between architect and fabricator, between fabricator and educational organization, between educational organization and architect, really is valuable. I suppose all I said in that comment was, it's a great thing that we're having this discussion. And I'll plead jet lag and pull back. Yeah.
I presume in that discussion, the status of the specialists at the table might be saying, well, hang on, I'm the ones that are not the kind of champions of the ubiquity of all of the technology, but the holders of genuine expertise to be able to bridge the gap between, or close the gap, sort of quote, between that of the realm of ideas and that of really the responsibility of being able to work out the all technical aspects from its engineering to its construction delivery and assembly and the economics and et cetera of all of that. I mean, to come to the defense of the ideas within this, I think it's very dangerous to separate the realm of ideas, knowledge, and conceptual apparatus of the architect from the technologies and from the techniques that we use. And to say that becomes a kind of, that the technologies become a kind of expertise that either specialist architects have, or the world of fabricators and engineers, which is really the structure of today's discussion. Is the academics presented, our presentations of the work that we do, broadly speaking, in teaching, research, and practice. And then there's a kind of session with the specialist architects. And this is not now criticizing Alan and Jeroen's organization necessarily. Then there's the specialists and engineers, and then the fabricators, sort of in the end. And I think it's a nice provocation of those three areas to kind of now have to sit down and negotiate, in some sense, how one in this sort of venue of this kind of program would work together. But I think to come in some sense to the defense of the academic arena, what that enables, is maybe back to what, Brett, you were posing as either a provocation or a observation. I'm not sure which, really. I think it's more a provocation of our redundancy as a result of these technologies being so ubiquitous. I think what the academic involvement, whether it's teaching or research, can contribute to this culture of technologies is the fact that we're not necessarily interested in efficiency. We're not interested in construction delivery per se, or the economics of efficiency, or the time of efficiency, which is really the production to delivery end of technology. But really, in terms of the time that's afforded by a studio context or a research context, is one which is quite irresponsible. So it's not actually concerned with the responsible delivery of everything being on time, to budget, etc. But actually, there's a kind of space which is given over within an academic context of teaching and that of research, which wastes a lot of time, in effect, to discover innovations through serendipity, through error, through accident, which is really what architects have done with technology, is misuse them and misappropriate them really quite productively over the last couple of decades.
That's the paradox as well, though, system. Point out that all the people here are actually doing a lot of work to make technology more accessible, more easy to use for architects. So they have to know less about it to be able to use it more in different ways.
And I would add, there's a kind of indulgence that comes out of that framework, where the emphasis on the problem, it develops its own kind of complexity. Because of having that time and space to focus on those things. And I think that on the one hand it's a luxury, but at the same time that's probably what I end up selling to the other side. Brett, you had talked about firms having research components embedded within them, at the same time that on the opposite side we're trying to develop kind of project-based research. And what I end up sort of offering to that firm as a kind of partnership is saying, I'll give you one faculty member or a team, 15 students in 4 months, just devoted to dealing with whatever that problem is, which within the space of practice is an incredible luxury. Within the space of industry is also a luxury if it's related to a particular material product, because that's something that, unless there is a project that's driving it, that would never happen. So from my perspective, it becomes about offering a kind of intellectual capital, a block of time that can just explore material process, etc. And that becomes at least what I consider the kind of gains on either side of that partnership.
But may I sort of look at that from real life, as it were? Yeah. Because I do think that what you're describing, this kind of, call it indulgence or whatever it is, this is what we want out of this, because we're talking, we can waste so much time an inefficiency in how we deal with each other and how we work with each other and how we translate information from one bit to another and how we triple handle everything, that our time is actually spent on this sort of nonsense, while it would be much better spent thinking and designing and actually developing ideas. And developing ideas, this is in real life exactly as in your world, isn't a straight line. It just doesn't work like that. It goes all sorts of ways, and you never find it, you never go from A to B in one straight line. That doesn't happen in my practice either. So we want to have the time to actually zigzag around all the different solutions to be at the end comfortably at point B, knowing that we have a good solution and knowing that we can then translate that into something real.
But that is the main difference, isn't it? I mean, failure is not an option in our business. It definitely is an option in academia because you still learn a lot.
Not well received either.
And that's basically the main difference.
Yes, but how are you developing everything in a straight line?
No,
You get your problem and you solve it. You don't.
I was actively supporting you, basically.
Thank you.
I love idling around and thinking about this, if I can have the time for that.
Well, that's the thing. It's not about idling around, yeah?
If I have a project and if I have to come up with a solution, it has to work in the end. And if there's a student project somewhere, I mean, there's a lot of learning effect also if the thing probably doesn't really work that well in the end. And that's the difference here, I think. And that's why this cooperation.
Okay, fair enough.
For us also is interesting to see. And exactly the way, like, sorry, how to put it. It's a luxury to have a few man hours left to do things that, I mean, how many things are there on your desk you always wanted to try out and never really had the time to put this into this sort of framework is definitely an option for us to say, okay, I don't have to do it myself, probably there's somebody who's doing it for me and then gives me a report in the end and a few new ideas.
As the conversation goes along, you're starting to make me feel guilty for taking time away.
He could have said no.
I mean, one way I map the difference between the three parties involved in a conversation like this today, for many years I've thought about the difference being primarily time. I.e., students have time to do things that many professionals claim or expect that they don't. And industries, in my experience, manufacturers especially, invest in projects that operate across time scales that, from even a professional point of view, are staggeringly long. We work with a manufacturing partner in Japan that's in their 27th, 28th year of developing a construction system that you first of all think is only Japanese in its possibility, that they actually started this in the 80s and they're still working on it. But in effect what they're really arguing for is a kind of project unfolding over a time frame that either we as an academic institution or in a normal professional life you wouldn't conceive of. And I think one of the interesting questions for me, and particularly for a species like architects that tend to privilege space above all else, is what is possible with time as a constituent element of the kind of conversations taking place here? How do we structure either projects or ambitions or goals in time frames that are simply different than the ones that we're accustomed to, whether we're a student or a teacher or a professional or a manufacturer that's used to operating in a different form? I think there are time forms, just like there are building forms, that we fall into. One of the ways I've tried to explain why so many people from around the world would fly to London at immense expense to spend a year and a half or 3.5 years in a place like this is that they really are trying to claim a time frame that they simply don't have in these other places. It's not that we can teach them something universal, nor that we can offer them a cheap way of living in a city like London, but we can offer them a time frame that in other studies they simply couldn't get to. And I think one of the interesting things for the partners, for me, would be how to present what you're doing in a time frame rather than simply in terms of a commercial, academic, or professional goal that you're working towards. So I think there are amazing discoveries in the kind of things that are being shown in the parts today that I saw that really are challenging the assumption I have in a school that, for example, defines everything by a 32-week kind of period, which is how our students all think. They're all thinking about next June in their portfolio. that'd be one of the challenges for a conversation like this as it goes forward, when we bring these three parties together in some way.
What's interesting, Brad, I started thinking a lot about this particular problem when, in things like setting up these workshops, where we were trying to find a kind of interface between sort of students, faculty, and professionals, and found that the only times we could operate were all of those gaps. So we started running these things on weekends or at nights because we were intentionally trying to find spaces of overlap. Or doing sort of special studio sessions in the summer, or things like, the visiting school, the 10-day block, because it's about how much time somebody can take out of their existing life and that reality in order to explore something else. And there were different frameworks for this, and so the workshops were more primarily very quick, intensive sessions. The 10 days provided something else. The 3-week version produced something else entirely. And if we were talking about sort of exploring something that became a longer-term research project or endeavor, it requires an entirely different rhythm in relation to what's happening. And I know that's sort of part of our discussions here, but I think it's an interesting problem.
I just wonder, looking, let's say, 20 years ahead, when perhaps the design school becomes a vessel for these workshops that kind of swarm around the world, and collect in certain locations for a discussion like this, and then do a workshop, and then everyone goes to somewhere else, and then they reconfigure it in a different way. If we think about 20 years from now, how does that impact the kind of work that you're doing, looking that far ahead? And my other question to you is, in terms of the program, in terms of the cultural and media organizations that are looking to get involved, or that that are there. So how do you look to kind of engage with cultural and media organizations in another way? And I also wonder, in the research that you're doing, it seems that it's formal, or it's kind of technical or structural, but I also wonder where the kind of entrepreneurial or business aspect of that is within the teaching to the students. Because I think, obviously there's a bunch of you who've actually created a niche in this architectural market, which is super interesting. And I think there are a lot more opportunities for architecture students to kind of go out and figure out what opportunities there are within architecture, whether it's sourcing materials or new technologies, or even culture and media, which, at the moment is missing a little bit. So I think that can really, possibly be brought into the team and add a lot. So I guess those are kind of questions for you, in terms of the.
I think in terms of to take your first point about the cultural and media organizations, that's something that really, once the program is up and going, then it will make sense to have local partners, probably associated through each of the academic institutions. But your point about the kind of business side of it, or entrepreneurial one, is quite interesting, because in a way what was quite striking about today was through the presentations there's really this sense of fluidity right now in a lot of the practices that are happening. So for example, sometimes the architects are actually drawing or nesting panels that for manufacture, and other times it's the manufacturers or fabricators are coming up and in a way designing the projects. And there's this kind of flux that it's really, I don't think there's any one vision for the way it should be. There's just a kind of recognition that it's really dependent on the project, or up for anybody's kind of particular preference or the particular situation of the project. So I think you do have people like Fabian and Ben, who's a graduate from here, who are actually starting to do things slightly differently. And I think over the next few years, you're really going to see that tested in a number of different ways, where people are really trying to combine different kinds of specialism or knowledge in new kinds of businesses. So I think that's something that certainly a lot of the project over the next few years will be kind of dealing with and throwing
and
up.
I think it's sharing the information, because it's very hard to make money, and I think in sharing the knowledge of how to do that and actually making businesses work, I think is really valuable, and I think a lot of students can kind of glean something, whether they understand it or not, because they probably won't, because they haven't been in the situation, they don't know, they haven't yet perhaps dealt with the client or whatnot and understand the whole contracts issues, but I think.
To go back to Brett's earlier comment, time is money, right? What you're really thinking about are money problems, not money issues, not time issues. But I want to actually respond to the first part of your question, which took the assumption that the future is trending towards a kind of complete dissipation of the notion of an architectural curriculum. And perhaps in this sense, I might disagree a little bit with Brett, in the sense that at least at this point, I still see a value in the notion of an architectural curriculum. What you described sounds to me more like the professional universe, which is a series of individual projects that rove around the world, that gather different specialists around different types of problems, and that include research and design components, and that educate everyone involved in them, because architects, of course, are lifetime learners. And it's in a way, it's vaguely dystopian from my position as an educator, because it's a universe in which the academy has more or less vaporized into blurred, let's say, to use again the parlance from the beginning of the day, completely with the profession. I would argue the real distinction here is one between a future in which we envision architects as essentially formal idea havers, and then a whole series of other professionals, fabricators, material specialists, et cetera, as the rationalizers who take that form and find a way to make it happen, versus the education of architects as people who really know intimately how to put things together and actually begin the design process not by seeking some precise form and then seeking the ways to make it happen, but by intricately managing, and this goes back to my own sort of pedagogical predilections from the presentation, but intricately managing the local or specific material limitations and the desired form. Now, this is not to say that there aren't workshop situations in which precisely this is done, and I think those are valuable. But I also think that the curricular arrangement where a student attends an institution, gathers knowledge, interns in the profession, gathers more and separate knowledge, and then ultimately enters into a kind of continual period of lifetime learning on a project-based basis is a valuable one.
Jonathan, I was going to say that it's one of the reasons that we don't, it's not that we don't teach the tectonic or the material, but one of the reasons that form and space become privileged in academia is because of the distancing from the real world scale, material science, manufacturing, that gap never gets fully crossed, that we're always in some way representing it, referencing it, even when we're kind of dealing with full-scale models, it becomes the kind of mock-up, we're simulating it. But it's that gap that is a real gap in relation to the architectural process that ends up getting played out in relation to architectural schools. I wanted to sort of shift back to your question on and maybe give a partial answer in a different front, and this is more on the side of business. We have a DMBA program at CCA. It was actually the first in the States. It's a design MBA, sort of existing within an art and design school. And the interesting thing to me about the program, and it has a kind of range of students. Many of them come from art and design backgrounds and then want to learn how to make money. And because they are existing in an art and design school, they have things like venture studios, which is fascinating to me. I've been trying to set up a sort of dual degree between architecture and the DMBA. I was told by the president that it doesn't make enough money, which was fascinating to me as a sort of concept, because joint degrees mean that you only have students not in all of the classes, and therefore it's not economically viable. That aside, what's interesting about the way in which they operate is that they start with the idea of constructing a company based around the product, et cetera, and they're always looking for projects. We always have sort of a series of projects that are looking sort of for that other project. So we're trying to set up a kind of collaborations across between sort of groups of the MBA students and groups of the architecture students to look at that, and then pull in the sort of graphic design groups that are dealing with branding, and the marketing people that are outside the venture studio to say, you know, can we model that in academia through those that would end up in those worlds sort of after they leave the academic environment, and sort of start with those kinds of cross-disciplinary operations within the school itself, which I think is an interesting way to go about it.
One thing I was wondering about in relation to what Alex said about we never quite materialise, or we never quite grasp those other things when we represent them, but also in relation to time, is maybe there's something in giving the project a bigger life, and I know that happens in a way with the time scales in the AA, but we're kind of constrained to 13 weeks normally as a normal semester time, and so there's always this sort of starting from the ground, but actually one of the things which worked very nicely in the collaboration with CETA was taking a project over 2 years, but actually passing it around, and how far could you, if you had a big enough idea, how far could you pass that? Could you pass that into aerospace, into material science, and then bring it back, and or take something that you've already built in an architecture studio, and then take it from the point where it's reached into another iteration somewhere else. That seemed to me to have a lot of potential as a way to keep building.
I think probably I was pretty lucky, I don't know, but I had the luck to be part of two just 13 weeks long projects that actually managed to materialize quite a bit at the end. So I think it's possible to do basically one-to-one work within one term without with 15 architecture students or something like that. It's probably a question of what the ambition is in the end, and probably if the program is too ambitious, you'll probably not end up with a finished product after 13 weeks. But it's definitely possible to do something within 13 weeks that is materializing in the end. That would be one thing. And that's probably leads me to another thing. I'm all for specialization. I'm so specialized I don't even have a name for what I'm doing.
But there are specialists that can help you.
Yeah.
They prescribe something though.
So specialization is actually good. I just wouldn't allow the architects to claim that they're the only ones to have ideas. I think there is other definitions of idea havers than just architects, and that leads me to the point where I think it would actually be good to. I would be pretty relieved if architecture schools would allow students to do what 95% probably of all architects in the real world out there trying to make a living out of this are doing, and that is not being designing architects but taking care of a million other things around. And that's what I'm missing a bit, and that is what makes my life very difficult at times, because it's very hard to find architects that don't want to design things but build things. And I think that is something that architecture schools definitely should address, probably just by opening up their programs to people who want to be architects in a broader sense, but not necessarily designing things that someone else is then figuring out how it's actually going to materialize. That would be one hope for me, and also part of my business model in a way. To find the personnel that I actually need to do the jobs we're doing, because they're not coming out of architecture schools, they're very rarely actually, unfortunately. So I would allow actually much more specialization if people after a few years finally find out what their a special field could be and what they're taking the most fun out of, I would allow them to do that instead of pressing everybody into the same direction in a way.
But I think this is one of the main reasons why we should sit here, because you are quite right. There is a sort of dematerialization going on in how architecture as a profession is perceived, and it's about ideas, it's about drawing it, but very rarely do you find the one that actually knows what the material does and how it actually all goes together. And doesn't mean all of them are like that, but there's a bit of a tendency I've noted over the past 20 years, I'd say, or 15, and this forum can sort of work against this. And what I see, what's happening in the various schools actually is pretty hands-on, I mean, shin, cast, and concrete, and so on, the models, the Zurich Pavilion with the MTech group, and so on. That's old stuff, and what you showed us is old stuff that's very material, hands-on building things, and that's good news in a way, because I see a resurging of interest in material behavior, and maybe one day you get the people who you're looking for. But I think there is a tendency towards.
I mean, but I think in relation to a school like this, though, that there is, part of what we're trying to negotiate is, you could say, the tribalization of contemporary architectural culture. In fact, architectural culture is flattened out and formed small worlds, some of whom believe, like you should get your hands dirty, others who believe that they should do nothing but read European philosophers, others of whom are European minimalists in the early 20th century, some of whom always bend the surface to make sure it's curved. And that the interesting thing about each of those little worlds is that they don't talk to the other worlds. And I think one of the things is we try and balance out, like strike an equilibrium in a school like this, amongst 700 or 800 students, is to recognize that to a certain degree those tribes need their own spaces. And yes, we might be an infrastructure by which you can imagine a conversation taking place between them, but that when I made the point about there not being any institutional definition of curriculum, it's precisely that we want a world of 30 competing views of what an architectural project ought to be today. Some of whom are quite interested in manufacturers, others of whom, again, are philosophers, let's say. And I guess the question would be, how do we acknowledge, in fact, that contemporary culture in all of its forms is increasingly tribalized, i.e., it is no longer a world in architecture, music, or any other in which a definition of hands-on making is anyone other than a small group of people believe. However impressive and big this panel is in its dedication to design and production, the reality is it's an interestingly self-contained conversation to a degree, and one that we want to do work on within its logics, but that in fact it's part of a larger space of learning or education.
The two very important things in what you just said. One is that it's very self-contained. I mean, it was sort of almost irrelevant how many people sit here. We talk nicely amongst ourselves, and are all quite happy. But the other thing is the dialogue, It needs to happen, So I can see all the different tribals, I can see it being reflected also in the different specialisms that grow around the building process. Sort of focusing in and becoming smaller, more specialized, whatever. But it falls apart if we don't actually talk to each other, and if there isn't a dialogue that binds this together. And at the end of the day, if you want to build something, which is sort of one of the ambitions of architecture, at least for some people, then we need to see that we get this dialogue going. But I agree with you. We must widen it somehow. And not just talk amongst those who are like-minded immediately, and all.
Or that even those among that to me isn't necessarily Paul. It's that how can those of a like mind speak to one another differently than we might normally speak? And for example, one thing that Al and I were thinking about this months ago, bringing this great work together, that I had this fantasy that in fact we could ask you all to present what you haven't done, rather than to show what you've done. I mean, in a way, everybody has a sense of what's going on, and it's absolutely fantastic presentations during the day, and sort of see what, from any perspective, is, truly at the forward edge of the envelope in this area of interest. The interesting question amongst all of you, as some form of specialists, would be, what haven't I gotten to yet? can we actually even articulate that? And is there a way in which by putting people together at a table, we can discover what that unknown, that undefined project is yet? I mean, I'm just tempted to ask any of you, what haven't you done yet that you feel like you should have done by now? What project hasn't yet been taken on? What isn't in the portfolio yet? And that's in a way where this kind of, overwhelming kind of knowledge and ability might be pretty productive for you at some level. Figuring out how to crack that open and do the unexpected. I don't know if it would be maybe a 30-year project. But that's also been
Well, on that note, I think it's enough to give us to think about for tomorrow. What haven't we done? And what's next?
Yeah, that's our overnight.
Yes, exactly.
We'll all confess, remember, that will be in private, so it won't be recorded.
So thank you again, everybody, for coming such an extraordinary distance to be here today. And thank you to everybody else here who's attended for actually really kind of opening up the discussion a bit. So we'll leave it there for today.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.